Good morning and welcome to Rising. Happy Monday. Thank you for tuning in. There is so much news to get to, as there often is Monday morning. So much happening over the weekends now. We never get a break, Linda.
I'd hardly sleep, Robbie, but I'm glad to see you this Monday morning.
Glad to see you as well.
What's on your radar?
Happy to tell you. Well, President Donald Trump is determined to bring foreign governments to heel and is moving forward with tariffs on our neighbors, Canada and Mexico, in order to encourage them to take border security more seriously. Now, even if you believe, as many fervent supporters of MAGA do, that it's a necessary move to shore up U.S. national security and convince the rest of the world that Trump means business, no more treating us like chumps, the truth is that the tariffs are going to increase prices for U.S. consumers. That's just how it works. Now, maybe the short-term pain will be worth the long-term investment in restoring America's standing and making sure our borders are respected. But there will be short-term pain. Now, in theory, this could create an opening for the Democratic Party. American voters, after all, do not like higher prices. Inflation was a top concern of voters in this election. And if Trump is perceived as having failed to bring prices under control, then the Democrats could, in theory, capitalize on that. Unfortunately for the Democrats, but very, very fortunately for the GOP, there's little evidence that Team Blue has learned from any of its mistakes. Look no further than this past weekend's Democratic National Committee leadership elections, where a new chair was elected to replace outgoing chair Jamie Harrison. That new chair is Ken Martin, a Minnesota politician and previous vice chair. Now, the best thing about Ken Martin is that he was opposed by some members of the Democratic establishment. Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries all endorsed his leading opponent, Ben Wilker. That should be a badge of honor. The leaders of the party have driven off a cliff given Dems' recent electoral performance. But even so, Martin does not seem to think the Dems have a messaging problem. On the contrary, he confidently assured Democrats gathered for the leadership election that the party already, quote, has the right message. Worse still, Martin and virtually every other nominee position doubled or even tripled down on identity politics as the way forward for Democrats. The Atlantic magazine's Jonathan Chait described a meeting that was marred by, quote, a land acknowledgement, multiple shrieking interruptions by angry protesters, and a general affirmation that its strategy had been sound except perhaps insufficiently committed to legalistic race and gender essentialism, end quote. In fact, outgoing chair Jamie Harrison spent significant time explaining that the rules for the vice chair race specify that, quote, when we have a gender non-binary candidate for office, the non-binary individual is counted as neither male nor female, and the remaining 6 officers must be gender balanced. That sounds like a kind of parody of wokeness that one might hear on a South Park sketch. But no, it really happened. And the leadership candidates supported this strategy of race and gender obsession. Now, they were given practically no choice. The leadership debate was moderated by a bunch of MSNBC pundits, the very wokest of the woke, and they continually pressed the candidates to prioritize skin color, token diversity, and every kind of cultural signifier that thrills mainstream elites as much as it annoys everyone else, in particular the working class. Independent left-leaning journalist Lee Fang described the event as, quote, a dark money election of party loyalists, more consumed with identity politics than interested in why working-class voters have drifted away. If anything, that's an understatement. Jonathan Capehart, for instance, one of the moderators, pressed the gathered candidates to concede that Kamala Harris's defeat at the hands of Donald Trump was due to racism and sexism. Let's watch.
I have a show of hands. How many of you believe that racism and misogyny played a role in Vice President Harris's defeat? Okay. So that's good. You all pass.
Did you catch what he said there at the end? That was the moderator asserting that the only correct answer to that question was yes. Blame racism, blame sexism, blame anything but Kamala's own campaign. Now, one of the candidates up there that was trying to have a more nuanced opinion on all of this was Faye Shakur, former campaign director for Bernie Sanders. He is a minority himself, but thinks the way Democrats talk about race and diversity issues is alienating to normal people.
But if we focus on these kinds of economic justice issues, I believe we have an opportunity to bring people in who may not agree with us on racial, cultural, and other social justice matters. But when they see that Democratic Party put economic justice as a primacy issue, I do believe that it is our long-held proud lineage that's what they want to support.
That was a good answer. I don't agree with Shakir's views on all economic issues, but I would readily concede that the platform he advocates, focusing first and foremost on the government delivering on benefits for working people, that is a winning platform. You know what's not a winning platform? Blaming the voters and calling them racist. Unfortunately, that's exactly what MSNBC wants the Democrats to do. Let's actually watch the question from Capehart that had produced the response we just watched.
Given that President Trump ran and he openly and consistently employed racist and misogynistic rhetoric on the campaign trail, we cannot ignore the role of fear and hate in Vice President Harris's defeat. How would you, as DNC chair, handle voter prejudices while also addressing their real concerns about substantive policy issues?
Voters' prejudices. To be clear, Shakir's answer is not the problem. The problem is the question he was asked, which presumed that voters are too racist and uninformed, and that's why someone like Kamala couldn't win. No, Kamala couldn't win because her advisors spend too much time listening to people like Jonathan Capehart. With friends like these, Democrats could be permanently doomed to toil in obscurity. Honestly, it's unsporting for the GOP to be so thoroughly unrivaled. The American political system functions better when both parties are competing for the support of everyday working Americans. If one party is doing that, while the other is doing land acknowledgments, this doesn't end well. To talk more about this issue, we have, I'm pleased to say, independent journalist Lee Fang is with us here at Rising. Lee, thank you so much for joining Linda and I.
Hey, good to see you, Robbie.
So you covered this leadership election debate series a bit more thoroughly than I did. So please tell me if my impressions of it were off. But every clip I saw make its way onto social media, I was like, oh my God. And I think conservatives were saying, oh my God, they were so happy to see so much of the conversation derailed by whatever you want to call it. I would call it identity politics, but whatever it is, to me, it seems anathema to what many Democratic voters are looking for.
No, your comments were completely on the mark here. This did not sound like a party that was really motivated to win future elections. It sounded like an institution that was in denial of the very recent past of the 2024 election. They were not willing to discuss the problems with President Biden and his cognitive decline, the kind of denial around that, the very shaky departure, why it took so long for him to step down, the process for nominating Kamala Harris, any of the issues around Kamala Harris's campaign. There's really a litany of issues where the Democratic Party has fractured and has, failed to appeal to voters. None of these issues were discussed. There's a dynamic kind of generally known as the iron law of institutions, that many times institutions, elites within an institution are more motivated to focus on the control of the institution rather than adapting for the success of an institution. So here we have party leaders, rather than adapting for the future success of the Democratic Party, they're doubling down to make sure that they control the institution at hand. So these are Democratic bureaucrats, no discussion of the many corporate lobbyists that make up the DNC voting members. This party election, this was not for the voters, really for grassroots people who consider themselves Democrats. These are party chairs. These are lobbyists for insurance companies, for drug companies. Even the outgoing chair, Jamie Harrison, he's a former defense contractor and pharma lobbyist. And, rather than discuss any of these ethics issues or these issues with big money or dark money, it sounds more like a faculty meeting at an elite college where they're talking about superficial identity politics, the politics of gender. You had these vice chair candidates, rather than discussing their experience or their new ideas to change the party, they're obsessively, you watch the party forum, they're obsessively talking about their own biography in identity terms, talking about their skin color or their sexual preferences as qualifications to run the party. So this is a party that's inherently, essentially out of touch with normal people. The polls show, recent experience shows that the voters are tired of this kind of, for whatever you want to call it, woke, a form of politics, this kind of very elite form of class politics that are obsessed with race and sexual gender. But again, they've doubled down really on the status quo, and they're seemingly incapable for change.
Lee, what else did they talk about as part of this electoral process the other day?
Well, look, if you watch the clips here, there were some discussion of reform of the party. You know, there's anger among many officials there of, you know, a lack of transparency in the budget, kind of a focus on big money consultants. No names were named because I think a lot of those consultants were in the audience. Folks like Dewey Square Group and others, these kind of establishment consultants that have really drained the party of money, not really established many significant results, that still control the party. Dewey Square's partner, Minion Moore, was the chair of the DNC convention last year. So, you know, these party consultants are really play a powerful role. But rather than really discussing the conflicts of interest there, because these are folks who also, again, represent Silicon Valley, Uber, the big pharmaceutical companies, there was, again, this kind of obsession with racial quotas and affirmative action. Ken Martin, the candidate who eventually triumphed and is now the chair of the DNC, he said, you know, we need to have Black-owned or minority-owned consultants. That's the issue. You know, it's like, again, this kind of beginning to discuss a reform issue, but then veering off into the superficial politics of identity. And of course, there are many platitudes about needing to organize more, needing to you know, knock on every door, or, you know, work in all 50 states. Sure, that sounds good, but, you know, that's the kind of rhetoric you hear every 4 years at these types of elections or forums. There really weren't that many discussions of big ideas or how to appeal to the big voting blocs that have left the party. You know, working class has left the party. You know, voters who are making less than $50,000. You know, historically, a column that was always in the Democrats' favor, voted for Donald Trump. You had a big departure of Black and Latino men to Donald Trump. You have the youth vote, especially young men, going to Trump. And, you know, there was no discussion really of this crisis, of how to fix this monumental problem for the Democratic Party.
And the role of MSNBC in this debate was, I think, particularly pernicious, or will have a particularly pernicious impact on the party. You know, if these people see their goal, you know, if they want to branch away from the kind of identity politics we're describing, they were going to be beaten up by the moderators of this forum, of this format. You know, if they see part of their job, or their main job is to be on MSNBC and speak to the audience that is there, which is very partisan motivated Dems, I would say it's a shrinking audience, and it's not enough to still win an election, but you do have to speak to those people to some degree. Of course, they're part of the base. They're going to be incentivized to do that in language that is increasingly alienating to everyone else, per the instructions coming from Simone Sanders and Jonathan Capehart and the other people. They were like encouraging the candidates to portray themselves in maximally alienating ways, seemingly without any self-reflection, with less reflection than the candidates themselves have.
No, that is an excellent point. And look, there's a lot of great media outlets out there, but every media outlet reflects its own biases, right? Like, we don't see the RNC going to the Wall Street Journal editorial board to moderate their, you know, equivalent forums. You know, the Wall Street Journal is a great institution, but their editorial board represents a certain faction of the party, represents a more pro-big business, pro-establishment, pro-neocon ideology. And so, you know, if you go to a certain media outlet that has that ideology, they will corral you in line with that view. So if you go to to MSNBC, that is very obsessed with superficial identity politics, very establishment friendly, then, you know, no surprise here. That's the kind of corral that's the moderators are pushing the candidates towards their own issues, their own pet issues, towards, again, superficial identity politics. I mean, really, not to flatter you guys, but for the DNC, for Democrats to adapt to the future, shows like this, like Rising, shows that are anti-establishment, that are populist, that are heterodox, that discuss big ideas and kind of represent kind of outside the box thinking, that needs to be the kind of focus for Democrats. Look at what Donald Trump did last year. He avoided the kind of establishment media that represents kind of the conventional wisdom or the status quo. He went on Theo Vaughn, he went on Joe Rogan, he went on these more populist podcasts because that is what is more in sync with viewers. I mean, this idea that MSNBC, that, in prime time, they have something like 300,000 listeners or less, and they would just eschew populist YouTube shows or online media that has tens of millions of audience members. I mean, that just seems crazy, but it shows you where the Democrats are. They're really not in line with what voters are doing. They're kind of desperately seeking media outlets and other institutions that reaffirm their establishment bias.
Well, Lee, we will take that compliment about rising, but I do want to circle back to the point you're making about who was in the room and who was listening. It seems fair to point out that it was an audience of party stalwarts, and that most people, most ordinary everyday Americans, are not tuning into the DNC chairmanship election. I wonder if you had the chance to talk to any of the candidates either heading into the election or coming out of it about other conversations they might be having to a broader public about the issues.
Look, I've talked to a few DNC members. There is kind of a concern around this kind of reorientation towards the establishment. The former kind of Biden-appointed chair, Jamie Harrison, and others, they changed the party calendar. There was not much of a discussion around this, but there's a lot of alarm in the kind of back rooms of the Democratic Party about this orientation towards the establishment. Historically, the Democratic Party chose their candidates through a calendar that had Iowa caucus going first, and then New Hampshire, and then South Carolina. For whatever reason, it's worth a longer discussion. I don't think we have time for it here. But rural voters, college voters, other voters in Iowa and New Hampshire seem to kind of drift towards more anti-establishment populist candidates. That's 1968. That's where you kind of saw voters rebel against President Lyndon Johnson over the Vietnam War. When Bill Clinton was seen as an outsider in the early 90s, Bill Clinton did well in Iowa. Barack Obama, of course, triumphing in these early caucus states when he was seen as an outsider, Bernie Sanders and others. Well, guess what? As an overt attempt to kind of keep outsiders, keep populists out of the party, the Biden-appointed leadership of the Democratic Party changed the schedule. So, going up against, in 2028, when Democrats need to find a new viable leader, they changed the schedule to preferencing South Carolina first. And this is historically, this is a much older electorate, the most culturally conservative candidates in the country. And this is a state that, at least historically, preferences more establishment candidates. So it makes it more unlikely that another populist or anti-establishment or outsider candidate gets the nomination. It's really just this kind of layer after layer of institutional bias to prevent reform and change. And that's something that I've heard from several party officials, from several activists who are involved in the DNC, although I did not hear it in that forum in Georgetown. I haven't heard it much in these more public debates, but it's clearly an issue going forward.
Fascinating. Lee, thank you so much for your take on this issue.
Hey, thanks for having me. Good to see you both.
Shut it down. That's what Elon Musk has said that he and President Donald Trump agreed to do with the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID. Here's what Trump had to say about this on Sunday evening.
USAID, run by radical lunatics, and we're getting them out, and then we'll make a decision.
Elon Musk also weighed in yesterday, writing on X, USAID is a criminal organization, time for it to die.
As of today, the USAID website is shut down and employees were told to stay home. President John F. Kennedy established USAID in 1961. Every year, the agency sends billions of dollars around the world to do things like promote democracy, social causes, help reduce poverty, and treat diseases.
According to multiple reports, DOJ officials tried entering its headquarters in D.C. this weekend to access files and security systems. They were initially refused, but eventually were able to get in.
Lever News founder wrote on X, So officials from an alleged government agency, not actually created by any law, showed up to seize and shut down a government agency created by a long-standing law. What's the word for this again? Democratic strategist and Obama alumni Sawyer Hackett also chimed in, writing, "There it is. After Trump and Musk pledged to shut down USAID, staff received an email in the middle of the night informing them HQ will be closed today. USAID is an independent agency. Only Congress has the authority to eliminate it."
Former acting director of U.S. National Intelligence, Richard Grenell, wrote on X, "What Samantha Power did with your tax dollars at USAID should be an FBI investigation. She used your money to fund crazy radical programs and far-left activists. Investigate." Executive Director of the Foundation for Freedom Online, Mike Benn, said, "What you will quickly find as you enter the amazing USAID vortex of despair is that virtually every powerful political and financial motor of American society that promotes and lobbies for USAID is either directly on its payroll, works at a place that is, or is his or her donors due." And even left-leaning journalist and former Rising host Ryan Grim admitted that USAID is often used as a vehicle for regime control and U.S. intervention in the internal politics of our allies and adversaries.
Former U.S. Ambassador to Russia and now Stanford professor Michael McFaul wrote, "In 2012, when I was the U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Putin shut down USAID inside Russia. Why? Because their work supported free markets, democracy, human rights, i.e. causes that threatened Putin's dictatorship. Shutting down USAID is exactly what autocrats all over the world want."
So I think we're going to disagree on this. You're probably supportive of this program?
I am indeed.
Have not the American people said as thoroughly as they possibly can that they don't want their tax dollars spent propping up foreign governments or in aid to people elsewhere in the world, that the U.S. has enough problems and we want that money spent here? It's like it's bipartisan. It's a majority of the Americans. They don't want tons of money going to foreign governments.
I think that the American people also don't want people who are not sanctioned, not legal, coming in to access classified documents, which is what you saw opposition to at USAID over the weekend. I think that is definitely something that we should not sweep under the rug. More broadly, USAID, as we talked about here in the opening, really provides services in a way that I think, Ronald Reagan considered to be part of the United States role as a beacon on the hill. It's part of the humanitarian assistance that people all around the world have come to rely on, and it's also importantly part of the soft power that this country uses when other forms of diplomacy don't work.
But I mean, does it work? Does it? The feeling that so many of the American people, I think, have, not that I speak for all of the American people, is that despite being the global policeman, the global grain dole, are we getting favorable American policies? Do other countries take us seriously and do what we want? And should we even be projecting or forcing on them our policies? I want to be hands off. I want to be not involved in terms of our government and the rest of the world. We can do trade with the rest of the world if they want to have good relations with us. But I don't think we should be using American tax dollars to extort allies or enemies to get some foreign policy result that doesn't even work.
As Barack Obama said famously during his administration, globalization doesn't stop at our shores. And I think that it's really important that we use every tool in our arsenal to both shore up Americans' position in the international arena, whether it's through USAID or the State Department or other publicly funded efforts and programs that we have underway as part of the federal government. But we need to use whatever it is that is possible in order for us to make our way in the world.
I saw a friend of mine, Hannah Cox, point out on X, and this is a screenshot of the grant, that we've talked a lot about on this show funding for what I consider to be very dangerous scientific research in Wuhan, China, where COVID-19 originated. A lot of that was done by the National Institutes for Health, but an also grant-making organization that funded research done in Wuhan was USAID, $38 million to Eco Health Alliance, which has now been its relationship with the U.S. government has been terminated over concerns over what projects were being funded by, were being facilitated. They were funded by the U.S., facilitated by Eco Health Alliance in China. There are a lot of independent scientific minds with concerns that this is exactly how you ended up with COVID-19 in the first place. The lead grantee on this grant is Ben Hu, who is believed by the Wall Street Journal to be patient zero for COVID. Is this a responsible use of American tax dollars? I would say no.
I mean, I think it's a valid question that you're asking, Robbie. I don't think any federal program is ever going to be perfect, but I also think that USAID has certainly contributed to the well-being of Americans in many different ways, not the least of which USAID was also part of international efforts to address the AIDS epidemic that occurred, obviously, in large part all around the world, but also had a massive impact here in the United States. So that's one thing that I would point out. The other thing is, it shouldn't be lost that this attack, this demonization on USAID is also going to have a direct impact on jobs, both at the agency itself and on the many, many organizations all around the world that the various programs help to support.
Yeah, I mean, but I don't think we should look at the federal government as just some hiring kind of thing, right? I mean, you could, the theory of more anti-government people would be if the government is funded based on your tax dollars, more businesses, more people could create jobs if they had more of that money returned to them. And if we think of the federal government as just an employment scheme, then you would have you'd have a more and more, ever so more robust government with tons and tons of unnecessary employees. I mean, that's what many libertarians argue we already have. Elon Musk reduced, after he bought X, he fired 80% of the workforce, and it works just as well as it did before. Can the same thing be done?
Depending on your
government?
perspective, Robbie.
Well, it doesn't. I know people don't like, you might not like the moderation policies on it anymore, but it still works. It's not glitching out. It's not
technically
going down.
It functions.
Well, I think it functions just the same way it used to function, and if companies can eliminate 80% of their workforce and still function, the federal government can do that. Think of the saving. We're massively in debt as a country. Think of the savings we could have.
We are, and think of the savings that we could have if we, for example, curbed some of these tax breaks that we have for billionaires. I mean, there are many ways to balance the budget. There are many ways to get the overall deficit under control. I just don't think that cutting international programs that help fight against poverty and promote democracy in the world is really the place to look at this particular moment.
I disagree, but let us know what you think, viewers. Coming up on Rising, we will discuss the buzz around Trump's tariff war. Stay tuned. Tariffs, tariffs, tariffs. Terrific? President Donald Trump is defending his decision to impose 25% tariffs on Canada and on Mexico, and then a 10% tariff on China.
Here he is yesterday evening.
No, I'm not going to say. We may have short-term a little pain, and people understand that. But long-term, the United States has been ripped off by virtually every country in the world. We have deficits with almost every country. Not every country, but almost. And we're going to change it. It's been unfair. That's why we owe $36 trillion. We have deficits with everybody. We help everybody. We've been helping everybody for years. And to be honest, I don't think they appreciate it. So we're going to change that. We're going to change it fast.
Trump also wrote on Truth Social, "Make your product in the USA and there are no tariffs. Why should the United States lose trillions of dollars in subsidizing other countries, and why should these other countries pay a small fraction of the cost of what USA citizens pay for drugs and pharmaceuticals?" As an example, this will be the golden age of America.
The tariffs will go into effect Tuesday. In response, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said he would impose 25% tariffs of his own. Even Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre, likely the next Canadian PM, said Trump's tariffs were unjust and unjustified and is advocating for a, quote, dollar-for-dollar response.
Put simply, tariffs are a tax on importers of products into our country.
Now, there are multiple ways the cost can be bared. As the New York Times reports, importers could directly eat the cost and potentially lose profits, force the importer to lower the cost of the good, or pass it on to consumers. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum responded to Trump's move with a lengthy X post, writing in part, "Mexico does not want confrontation. We start from collaboration between neighboring countries. Mexico not only does not want fentanyl to reach the United States, but nowhere." To this end, I proposed to President Trump that we establish a working group with our best public health and security teams.
Republican Congressman Andy Biggs of Arizona wrote on X, "Fentanyl is the leading cause of death for Americans aged 18 to 45. President Trump's tariffs against the nation's engineering the fentanyl crisis show the rest of the world that playtime is over. Real leadership is back in the White House."
Former Congressman Tom Malinowski weighed in, writing, "Because Trump used his emergency economic powers to impose tariffs, any member of Congress can force a vote to terminate them. This is because the National Emergencies Act makes such resolutions, quote, privileged. If introduced, they must be quickly taken up. Dems should do this, exclamation point."
Founder and CEO of Professional Capital Management, Anthony Pompliano, wrote, "America's tariffs will create a black hole that will suck investment dollars and business operations into the United States. Don't want to pay the tariffs? Come build your products in America."
Republican Senator Rand Paul said, "Tariffs are simply taxes. Conservatives once united against new taxes. Taxing trade will mean less trade and higher prices."
So a lot of robust discussion of the tariff policy. And look, I've said that, so there's two ways you can view the tariffs. I don't think that tariffs are going to be obviously good for our economic situation in the short term. Tariffs result in higher prices on the goods Americans want to purchase. So that's not a good thing. I agree with Rand Paul that it's essentially a form of taxation, one that I would prefer was under the control of Congress rather than the office of the presidency. Now that's it, but Trump is not really using tariffs in or his justification for them is to get some foreign policy result. He believes, and he ran on, greater border security, particularly with Mexico, the number of illegal immigrants crossing the border and fentanyl getting into our country. His viewpoint is Mexico needs to do more to address that, and so the tariffs are a way of encouraging them to do that. So yes, it will cause us short-term pain, but Trump is betting that that will be worth it if it persuades Mexico to actually get serious about border enforcement.
Well, Robbie, I felt like I had to dust off my macroeconomics TA notebooks for this particular moment in our history. I think the challenge here is that, yes, if you were using tariffs as a negotiating tactic, then you could see justification in it. But even his latest remarks, he basically said there's nothing that our closest trade partners could do in order to change his mind.
Well, it did work with Colombia, right? They threatened tariffs on Colombia for not taking those flights of deported migrants last week. Colombia immediately folded and said, no, not only will we take them, we'll send our own planes to get them. So I think he's fresh off that success in thinking it might work out. I'm less sold on the fight with Canada, especially because Canada is verging on electing a government that is more friendly to Donald Trump in terms of Pierre Poilievre, whose approval rating was super high prior to this, and this has actually resulted in the Conservative Party in Canada's support for them going down, and now it's about even with where Trudeau's government was. So I would not want to. Trump should consider whether we shake off we impact the Conservatives in Canada in a way we don't want. But look, I hear his point about, and we're going to talk about this more when we discuss the USAID cancellation, but other countries free riding on the U.S., getting so much foreign aid, getting so much military support, our allies, everybody get everything they want from us, when the American people just clearly say, but we want dollars spent at home. We want Americans taken care of. I agree with Trump, and many on the left agree with Trump. The price of pharmaceuticals, for instance, here is astronomical. Now, I don't think starting trade wars with other countries is going to improve the prices of goods and services for Americans at home. On the pharmaceuticals front specifically, we could actually legalize importing pharmaceuticals from other countries, and then they wouldn't be able to charge. Everybody's mad that why does the pharmaceutical company charge so much money for Americans and the price of it is lower elsewhere? Well, if we could just buy it from the other countries, that would kill their incentive to do that.
Well, unfortunately, the argument about fentanyl doesn't really ring true on Canada in any case, which apparently supplies less than 1% of what we're seeing on the streets here. So that, I think, is in line with some of these arguments not quite lining up with this administration. I would also say that, in particular, he was directly asked, is there anything that, even including Mexico, could be done in order to stave off these tariffs? And his response was, no, we're going to raise revenue.
Yeah, it's going to raise revenue, and look, we're a competitor with China. China is also a geopolitical concern. I want to find better trading partners throughout the world, people who want to do business with America. I don't quite agree with the populist side of some of the MAGA folks that, we can suddenly re-headquarter all of these factories and everything in America. I think the regulatory and labor costs for doing that, look, I would be all for it. I'd be totally for relaxing all of those regulations so that you can do American manufacturing again. I just don't think, I don't think progressives are going to allow it because they don't want to relax any of those regulations. So it's not going to happen, and it's kind of a fantasy. But we don't need to have the factories, the chips, the raw material, everything we need coming out of China, an enemy of ours. But we do need to find other, better, more responsible trading partners. And we need our neighbors not to take advantage of us and not to find it's not as much a Canadian problem. It is a Mexico problem. I want to have a good relationship with Mexico, but they need to play ball.
Yeah, I think we just have to come back to the fact that these tariffs are going to raise prices significantly on ordinary, everyday Americans. And I recall growing up in poverty myself, and even increasing something by 25%, that might be the difference between whether a family can afford their groceries or not. And what we know is clear is that a lot of our goods come from Mexico, in particular produce. You've got all these people revving up and getting excited for Super Bowl Sunday, and yet you got to believe that those avocado prices are going to start going up pretty shortly here, assuming that these tariffs go through.
But let's say I want to vote against tariffs. I do want to vote against tariffs. I am against tariffs. Joe Biden was totally in support of them. Joe Biden did tariffs as well. There's been tremendous continuity in tariffs. And in fact, I would argue Democrats totally downplayed that the prices are too high kind of argument. And then the second Trump takes over and just continues some of those tariff policies, now their hair is on fire about the high price of everything. Like, well, why weren't you against those policies when they were actually under your control? I mean, I would say the same thing about Republicans. Unfortunately, I guess no matter which government you put in charge a government that does not take seriously the fact that everything costs too much. That's a shame. But are Democrats really offering a counter policy for it, given that they did the same thing?
I don't think it's the same thing, respectfully, Robbie. I do think that people on both sides,
China.
I think people on both sides of the aisle consider tariffs to be a potentially useful tool. Again, back to your point about if they are part of a negotiating tactic overall in our conversations with other nations, and also, for example, if it's an emerging sector where something like solar panels, where it might be useful to have tariffs to get them off of their feet.
25% tariff on solar panels. Again, that was a Joe Biden idea.
Sure, and it's a very specific, targeted way of using tariffs as opposed to these across the board blanket tariffs that are really going to impact prices overall.
I didn't like it when Biden did it. I don't really care for it now either, but we'll see how it all pans out. Next up on Rising, Piers Morgan and Tucker Carlson clashed on various topics. Fascinating debate. We'll talk about that. Stay tuned. Clash of two major television personalities, Tucker Carlson and Piers Morgan, got into a testy debate over Piers' admiration for the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Let's take a look.
Maybe he's a better guy than Putin or whatever, and you could say some things about one or not the other, but like if we're just going to define dictator, the first feature of a dictator is he's not elected. So Zelensky's not elected. He's also, he's banned a religious denomination. He's murdered his political opponents. He has banned a language group. Those all seem like features of dictatorship to me. He calls himself that, but there's no election that made him president. He blew past the election and said, oh, there's a war. We can't have an election. We're going to change the Constitution. So how is that a legitimate leader? How could you support something like that? That seems, I don't know, like a dictatorship.
Well, I would categorize my support for him as supporting him against an illegal invasion by Russia.
So this is like why we support Stalin against Hitler, because
well, in a way, we had
Hitler's
that debate.
bad, so Stalin must be good. But no, Stalin's also a dictator. So, like, how about we just don't support dictators if we're against supporting dictators?
Tucker continued pressing Piers on his love for Zelensky. Let's watch.
I don't claim it's Mother Teresa against Hitler.
No, but you have, though. He's a marvelous person.
I like him. I'm allowed to, aren't I?
I guess you like dictators. I've never said of Putin he's a marvelous person because, like, it's a little dictatory for me. I think he's really smart. I admire what he's done to Russia, but I'm not going to sniff his jock because he's kind of a dictator. But you're like, oh, I love that Zelensky. He's so great.
I do like him.
How can you like a man who's a dictator?
Interesting debate.
Interesting choice of phrasing there.
Yeah, I don't care for that, but I mostly agree with what Tucker was saying there. I thought this was a really interesting debate. They got into a lot of subjects. We talked about the World War II Churchill thing. I'm less partial to what Tucker had to say on that subject, although I very much agreed with him. He laid into Piers, we don't have this clip, but over Piers Morgan's support for what Israel is doing in Gaza, and Tucker was just like, I think the murder of innocent children is wrong. I don't know, can't believe you won't say that. But, he points out that, look, I too, Russia illegally invaded Ukraine, and that is wrong, and there's no way around it, so there's nothing nice you should say about the Russian government or about Vladimir Putin. But I don't know how Zelensky can be treated as some shining bastion of liberal democracy when A, the election was suspended, B, they got rid of, they banned all oppositional political parties, they banned oppositional media, they're doing mass conscription of people, including of people not military age anymore. Those all sound like those are things you suspend. If you suspend liberal principles during emergencies, during wartime, then you're not really governing as a democratic liberal.
Well, I think that they have been dealt a very tough hand, for sure, and that this conflict has lasted far longer, I'm sure, than President Zelensky ever could have imagined that it would. I mean, honestly, I'm not quite sure how the function of elections could carry on in Ukraine, given everything that's happened over the last few years. I mean, it's definitely a dire situation all around.
Yeah, it's a dire situation all around, but then the question becomes, well, are they making it worse? I mean, this is going to end with Russia fully conquering the country at some point, which I think would be terrible. So they should have diplomacy short of that, where unfortunately, from my view, Russia will end up getting something it wants in exchange for not continuing to mow down every Ukrainian person, which I think would be terrible. But if that results in the independence or even the Russian territorial gains of the easternmost areas of Ukraine, is that ideal? Absolutely not. Is that better than us promising the country, as Joe Biden did, that we're going to defend them till the end of time, there'll be an endless supply of money? There's clearly not a political will on our side to do that anymore. It's not resulting in them winning, it's just resulting in them losing more slowly, which you can say, fine, you can make the case, let's help them lose more slowly so that we can do a negotiation, so that the country doesn't entirely collapse. But then you actually have to have that conversation. And I don't know what the problem is. I don't know why it can't be facilitated, but we can't continue to support that. Like, they're not going to have enough people. The whole country is eventually going to fall to Russian control. Our own military advisors think that. Zelensky's military advisors think that. They think the project of propping up the Ukrainian resistance just cannot go on forever. So I don't know why you wouldn't push including the Ukrainian side, to negotiate more fervently. Well,
I think that we have enough resources that we could continue to support them so long as there actually is bipartisan support for that idea. I do think, President Trump came in, he said on the campaign trail that he was going to solve this and end the Russian aggression immediately, and we haven't seen any work in that area to date. Maybe it's happening behind the scenes, but we haven't heard anything about it. If there is a solution to get to a peaceful resolution, I'm sure everybody's on board.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is what Trump managed to do with Israel and Hamas, incredibly. He helped persuade Israel to agree to a deal that had been on the table that Joe Biden, for whatever reason, had been unable to get Netanyahu to sign off on.
Well, and I think they were both pushing at the end
exchange of, I think it was mostly Trump. He seems to be getting a lot of the credit for it, but it has resulted in the release of hostages, and I think that's great. So I hope Trump, turns his attention to this situation, because it's terrible. And yes, we could continue giving them money and weapons and all those things, but who's even? They are now having to do conscription, falling outside normal military-aged males. There, videos of people being dragged from their homes to go serve in the Ukrainian armed forces. I'm worried about. We've had this experience in the Middle East. Just sending weapons. Well, who's on the ground getting those weapons? If it's now less trained soldiers that are going to immediately surrender when they're overtaken by invading armies, and then all those weapons are going to end up in our enemies' hands. That's exactly the experience we had in the Middle East, with ISIS uses U.S. weapons because they come in and they scooped up the insurgents we funded on the other side. They kill them or capture them, and they take the supplies. I don't want the same thing to happen to with Russia?
Yeah, I mean, these are legitimate questions that I think we've been grappling with for decades now under both Republican and Democratic presidents. I think, though, the question about Ukraine at this particular moment is really fundamentally not disconnected from our larger discussion about the role of the U.S. in the world. And I think part of the reason why we saw such strong bipartisan support early on for the conflict was we wanted to support a democracy, and we want to make sure that democracy flourishes and doesn't fall to illegal aggressions from others.
Well, I want to support democracy, but that speaks very much to what Tucker Carlson is saying there. Is it a democracy if they don't have elections? Is it a democracy if they outlaw rival political parties? Is it a democracy if there's no freedom of speech anymore in the country? You know, I understand it's a war, and it's one thing to suspend these rights during a crisis or an emergency, but you know, I tend to think that if the rights go out the door the second there's an emergency, that makes your argument more difficult to make, that you're a good liberal democracy.
Well, I think it is a crisis, and he was elected, and so it isn't as if he seized
Well, he was elected
power.
initially.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But we're talking about a country that doesn't even have basic infrastructure in place now because of the relentless bombing and the relentless attacks over the past several years now from Russia. And so I think it's a fair motion to make. It's a fair state to be in, that you don't carry out the normal work of government when you're just trying to keep your people alive.
Coming up, is CBS caving to Trump? We will explain in a bit. CBS News has agreed to release a full transcript of former Vice President Harris's October interview with 60 Minutes to the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. Now, that decision came after the FCC sent a letter to CBS asking for a, quote, full unedited transcript of the interview conducted ahead of Harris's loss to President Trump in the 2024 election. The commission also requested the camera feeds from that episode.
Now, Paramount is in talks to settle a $10 billion claim that it deceptively edited a 60 Minutes interview with Kamala Harris. Paramount is currently concluding an asset sale of its Hollywood studio business. The news of Paramount's decision, which has reportedly caused deep upset in the CBS newsroom, and I should say, I was a political commentator for CBS News for the better part of 6 years, so I want to make sure that's clear. The news comes after ABC News agreed to pay $15 million to Trump to settle a defamation lawsuit over inaccurate comments by anchor George Stephanopoulos that Trump had been found civilly liable for rape.
This has apparently opened the floodgates into media investigations, as the FCC is now set to consider a slew of cases against top broadcasters, including CBS, ABC News, NBC News, and also Fox. The FCC also recently launched an investigation into the public broadcasting stations NPR and PBS, alleging those outlets aired commercials that are in violation of federal regulation.
Bernie Sanders had this to say on X. Authoritarianism is intimidating media, curtailing dissent, and undermining our First Amendment. Trump has sued ABC, CBS, Meta, and the Des Moines Register for comments that offended him. His FCC is now, quote, investigating PBS and NPR. Democracy is not negotiable. We will fight back. Robert Reich had this commentary. CBS's parent company, Paramount, may settle Trump's frivolous lawsuit against 60 Minutes. Why? So it can get approval from Trump's FCC to be acquired by Sundance for $8 billion. Skydance was founded by the son of Larry Ellison, one of Trump's major backers. Hello?
Well, look, we've discussed the actual 60 Minutes interview before. I agree that it was deceptively edited to make Kamala's answer sound more coherent, although, frankly, even the edited version was not particularly coherent. It was a question about what to do with Israel and Gaza. Now, however, I defer to they have the right to edit interviews however they want, and if they want to make a misleading pro-Kamala kind of thing, then they can do that, and we can criticize it. I think the lawsuit is basically frivolous and should not be pursued, and I don't really want the government, the FCC, to be overly policing what broadcasters, which are private companies and private individuals, get to say. That is a free speech issue for me. It is one, however, I would point out that bureaucrats and Democratic congressmen frequently do. Elizabeth Warren sent a warning letter to Sam Altman, the president of OpenAI, for just giving to Trump's inaugural fund. Democratic lawmakers have sent threatening messages to Comcast and Verizon and Google and Amazon and everyone for advertising on or for hosting conservative news channels on their platforms or conservative news commentators. It's very, nice company you've got there. It would be a shame if we looked into your Section 230 liability protection. The tone of the FCC, not specifically under Trump, but just in general, of regulators toward private companies has been one of threats over speech for years and years and years now. So yes, do I think Trump should be doing this? Absolutely not. Is it new? No, it's something Democrats have been doing for years.
I think for the most part, I agree with where you're coming from here, Robbie. I don't think that the federal government should be involved whatsoever in policing the free press. By definition,
Indeed.
The free press should be free. And I think it is worth pointing out that the reason all of this is happening, both the attempts to settle the lawsuit and the fact that the lawsuits exist at all, is because of a very clear strategy that President Trump laid out in his first administration, his first term, that he wants to chill the free press. He doesn't believe in free media. He wants certain kind of coverage, and that is the only thing he will settle for. So I think overall this is very, very troubling. I would also say, small nuance thing here, on some of the actions, the letters that you mentioned from Senator Warren and others, I do think it's a little bit different to have something that is really an optics play, where they're putting out a letter that they think is going to get them some press coverage, and so they can, make a statement about where they stand. And I think that's very different than actually taking legal action, which could cost these companies a great deal of money, as we talked about.
Well, it is optics, but there has been a bipartisan push. It's faded a little bit, as I think Republicans are no longer as on board with it as they were initially. There was a bipartisan push to apply antitrust regulations more stringently, more strictly to large tech companies, to reevaluate Section 230, as I mentioned, which provides some liability for internet platforms from being sued over speech hosted on their platforms. Right? You can, if somebody defames you or slanders you on Facebook, you can sue that person, but you can't sue Facebook. That's because of Section 230. And a lot of Democratic lawmakers and also a lot of Republican lawmakers were looking at that and saying, yeah, but we don't like Facebook, so why do they have that protection? As a result, Facebook has now Mark Zuckerberg has moved more into the Trump coalition, has gotten Republicans to back off that strategy. And look, I know a lot of populist inclined people won't like that, but if government has the power to massively break up companies or to stop mergers of companies, well, then companies are going to be doing things like trying to break Republicans away from wanting to do that. They're also going to be the optics you described, the threatening messages, motivate them to say, well, then how can we work with the government if they just want to destroy us at every turn? Especially if they're coming after us for hosting speech or content or ideas that the government doesn't like, which was the basis of so much of Biden era, COVID misinformation, et cetera, all that. Was Biden officials, including at the White House, saying, oh my God, we are so furious with what's appearing on social media, and we're going to hurt you if you don't take down more of it. I mean, that has an impact. That impacts the free speech rights of the people, not just of the company, if you want to say that the company has free speech rights, but of its user base, right? Of their ability to share dissenting or contrarian information was impacted by the federal officials haranguing the companies.
I know you are a free speech purist
through
and through.
Which is why I don't like what Trump's doing. I don't like what Brendan Carr's doing. I would say leave all these companies alone, but this is not just beginning now.
Well, where we differ, Robbie, and we do differ in some places, is that I think that the federal government's fundamental role is to protect the public interest. And where those companies maybe grow out of control or they spread misinformation and disinformation that has a direct impact on public health, which I think is where the concern around COVID-19 was coming from, I think it is absolutely incumbent upon and the true responsibility of the federal government to step in and say something. That said, I think that the free and independent press is the bulwark for democracy, whether it's here in the United States or around the world. And anytime I see any moves that are made to curb that independent thinking, to try and restrict the types of things that free media are able to do, I think that is deeply troubling and something that everybody should be paying attention to.
Yeah, I mean, we're sort of agreeing. Look, I think the government obviously should work to serve the public interest, but there's no, what is in the interest of public health is a subject that can be debated, that is being debated.
Well, telling
by
people not to take a vaccine that's going to save millions of people's lives, that is against the public interest.
I mean, you could say that, but there's no that exception isn't in the First Amendment, right? The Supreme Court has never said, well, you can't say it if it's going to cause people to make negative health decisions, right?
Sure, but that's why it makes sense for the federal government to step in moments like that. And of course, the Constitution, love the Constitution, did not predict that we would be in this insane, chaotic social media feeding frenzy, disinformation environment that we live in today with deep fakes and everything else that people create to deliberately mislead the public.
Coming up next, what is going on at the FAA? We will discuss and probably debate. Stay tuned.
The Federal Aviation Administration was left without a leader for days. From President Trump's inauguration through January 30th, the day after the fatal aviation disaster struck, when a passenger jet and Army Black Hawk collided. According to reports, a squabble between Elon Musk and former Federal Administration Chief Michael Whitaker allegedly led to the administrator's exit, fueling speculation that the head of DOGE helped push him out. Musk called on Whitaker to step down months ago, posting on X back in September, quote, he needs to resign. Musk's bone to pick with him presumably stemmed over $600,000 fines against SpaceX that he had proposed. Finally, one day after the January 29th crash, Trump appointed Chris Rocheleau to be the acting FAA administrator. Rocheleau comes on board after yet another fatal plane crash. On Friday, a medevac plane traveling from Philadelphia to Mexico. The plane plunged to the ground a minute after takeoff. As of Monday, 7 people have been killed and 22 others have been injured.
Meanwhile, questions still remain about what led to the deadliest aviation disaster in years. While the Army released the names of 2 male soldiers aboard the Black Hawk, Chief Warrant Officer Andrew Lloyd Eves and Staff Sergeant Ryan Austin O'Hara, they had initially withheld the name of the third. Now, over the weekend, they did identify that person. It's 28-year-old Captain Rebecca Loback, who was the co-pilot of the helicopter. The Army cited her family's request for privacy as the reasons for delaying the release of her name.
This comes as DEI and hiring practices have been a source of contention. Trump last week appeared to blame the deadly collision on diversity, despite no evidence. Former Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg fired back at Trump again, posting on X, quote, to be abundantly clear, we did not change the rigorous standard for becoming a certified air traffic controller. Those claiming otherwise are mistaken or lying. We did increase funding and training and grew the ATC workforce after years of declining numbers, including under Trump. Last week, the president criticized Buttigieg's leadership as head of transportation in the Biden administration.
Now, investigators are still determining what caused the Potomac crash. As of Monday, the remains of 55 people have been identified, all 67 victims presumed dead. Well, we should start getting right into that. I don't agree with Secretary Mayor Pete whatsoever that there's no evidence that DEI is behind this. I mean, we should be careful with our claims, but there is, in fact, a lawsuit against the FAA going back years ago from applicants who were ruled unqualified under this utterly insane screening process where the most qualified applicants, is what is alleged in the lawsuit, were rejected intentionally. They wanted the less qualified people on purpose in order for diversity considerations. It's some really insane stuff. I haven't gotten all the way into it. We're going to try to get on Rising someone who's looked at this more closely. There's been great work done on it by a Substack account called Tracing Wood Grains for the Jesse Singal, Katie Herzog podcast, so I have a little bit of familiarity with it. We're going to look at it more closely coming up, but I do not agree that there's no evidence that we're making DEI hiring decisions at FAA. Now, I am not asserting that is the cause of the crash. I think it is important to investigate what the cause of the crash is. I find it incredibly suspect that there are helicopters being flown at all in this incredibly congested airspace from what we're now understanding in the DC area, where there are planes landing and taking off constantly. And what we're hearing is that it's possible that people flying the helicopter saw a plane. They thought they were being warned about a plane they could see, and they didn't know there was also another plane. It's such a crowded airspace, and that seems like a catastrophically bad idea. It's possible this was just, I don't know what to call it, reasonable human error, but one that is reasonable given how congested and how insane it is flying helicopters at night with planes landing and taking off all over the place, over the water, with lights everywhere because the city. It seems crazy to me. So we should look at that. We should look at everything. We shouldn't knee-jerk blame DEI or whatever, although this lawsuit is very suspicious to me, and I want to look at it more closely.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, Robbie.
Yeah.
And before we do any more unpacking on my part, I do want to disclose a couple of things. Viewers may or may not know that I worked in this administration specifically for
Buttigieg.
Secretary Mayor Pete, and saw firsthand the various policies and programs that were underway there. I also, as it turns out in that role, helped to advocate for then FAA Administrator Michael Whitaker getting confirmed by the Senate. And as part of that role, all my disclosures out in one place here.
Good.
I know Chris Rushlow very well. He and I had a lot of interaction when he was at the National Business Aviation Association, and I think he's a great candidate. He's a longtime FAA veteran, so the FAA is in good hands right now. Okay, so all of those on the table. There are so many troubling things about the way that this administration has responded to this horrific tragedy. You know, as you point out, Robbie, there are a lot of very technical things that need to be investigated, whether it is the ceiling at which those helicopters were restricted from flying, to how the air traffic control tower was being staffed at the time, to all sorts of other things, which, as we know, the National Transportation Safety Board is going to investigate. They're looking at the various black boxes and recorders from both aircraft, and they should have some simulations and things for us to learn about in the coming weeks there. So laying that all on the table, I have to say out loud, is just far too soon for anybody to talk about what caused it.
Oh, of course, I agree.
Back to the DEI thing, though. There are some very convenient facts that the president and his team failed to disclose when he lobbed this argument, which I think he was making very clearly. He thinks that DEI led to this crash. I think that was very clear as part of that long press conference that he had. And as you said, Robbie, you don't necessarily agree. But there's so many troubling things about it. First of all, if you actually look at the data, you will see that the vast majority of air traffic controllers are male, and they are white male. So to argue that somehow diversity was an issue here that caused this crash when you are almost exclusively staffed by white men all across the air traffic control towers in this country, you know, fails to pass the sniff test. The second thing is that it also ignores some really significant numbers. So air traffic control staffing has been on a decline and then has sort of been stagnated at a level that is below what you would like it to be for many decades now. But under the past administration, we saw those numbers go up because of intense recruitment practices and intense training programs that administration put into play. In fact, just last year, it exceeded its recruitment goals for the first time in decades. And so those are the types of things that my former boss was pointing out as part of his tweet response, his series of tweet responses to the president.
Well, as I said, I got to look at this lawsuit more closely and get someone on the show who has followed it in greater detail. I think the allegation was not necessarily that it was the kinds of hiring that they were doing was not necessarily successful at getting, you know, skin color diversity or whatever. It still resulted in, which is why you're correct to say that it's still mostly white male, but just that it was getting, but it ended up getting less qualified people overall, or very qualified people who had passed all the qualifications. Then they were suddenly their contracts, their employment, and this is going back years and years and years ago, was suddenly terminated because under this policy they were trying to screen out the best and most qualified applicants. So not that it didn't actually even result in more diversity, it just resulted in less good people to work at the FAA.
Yeah, and I just have to push back very, very strongly on that. You know, I have spent my fair share of time in air traffic control towers all across this country. And I have worked really closely with the air traffic organization and done the deep dive on the recruitment and the training programs that have been underway over the last several years here. And I can tell you unequivocally that the people that are working in these roles are deeply committed, incredibly professional, and very, very well trained. In fact, viewers may or may not be aware, it takes about 2 years from the time that you apply to be an air traffic controller until the time that you are certified to then work on the job under a supervisor who has approximately a decade of experience themselves. It takes about 2 years to get through that process. It is rigorous and it requires a commitment from the applicant that, you know, not everybody has.
Up next, Daily Caller News Foundation's Philip Lenczycki joins us to talk about China. Stay tuned. Well, there's no question that the Chinese Communist Party is one of the United States' greatest adversaries and competitors.
The The FBI has called the CCPA a grave threat to the economic well-being and democratic values of the United States.
Now, an explosive new piece for the Daily Caller News Foundation titled Exclusive, Chinese Communist Party quietly operates shadow justice systems in U.S. cities. Investigative reporter Phil Lenczycki writes, located throughout California, the greater Washington, D.C. area, Hawaii, and New York, the network of more than a dozen nonprofits share information with Chinese law enforcement officials, and some also host unsanctioned courtrooms in the U.S., a months-long investigation has discovered. U.S. lawmakers and intelligence analysts say that China's underground courts could easily be weaponized to punish dissidents and expand communist influence abroad. Here to discuss the situation is Phil Lenczycki himself. Phil, thank you so much for joining Rising this morning.
Thanks for having me on.
So what is going on here? This sounds like an explosive allegation of Chinese communist sympathetic courts or influence where that is going on. Tell us more about this.
There's a range of different entities that we have identified, and they all have different relationships with Chinese law enforcement departments in China. And so teasing that out is a little bit complicated, but the big picture is this. At one level, there are Chinese civic associations that are meeting with officials from the Ministry of Public Security in China to discuss overseas policing efforts. At another level, there are individuals who are leaders within these Chinese civic associations in the United States who are themselves members of the aforementioned Ministry of Public Security. And then finally, there are individuals who are a part of these Chinese civic associations who have been appointed by either people's courts in China or the Supreme People's Procuratorate as hearing officers or overseas mediation officials to operate some type of overseas courts here in the United States. So that's the sort of breakdown into three parts about what we found.
Philip, this seems like it could have been written by Hollywood. I had no idea that this was going on, and I'm sure viewers didn't either. Could you give us a sense of the scope and scale of this? How widespread is it? What communities are you talking about? And how many people are we talking about who would be impacted?
Maybe your viewers are familiar with the case of America Changle Association, which is a Chinese civic association that had its headquarters in Manhattan. And they were found to be operating an overseas Chinese police station. Recently, one of their leaders, Chen Jinping, he pleaded guilty to his involvement in this operation. And so what we're looking at here is sort of an extension of that. In fact, three of the individuals involved in the court operations were themselves members of America Changle Association. So not only was that Manhattan headquarters home to an overseas police station connected to Changle District in Fuzhou, Fujian Province, but additionally, what we're reporting is that some of their leadership was also appointed to operate some type of overseas court. And so, please.
No, go ahead.
And so across the country, what we're seeing then is if we look at, for instance, California, we found that there were several similar operations. Two of those were in San Francisco, and they were connected with a procuratorate and a court in Guangdong province. There's another civic association closer to Los Angeles, and they were working with a court in Zhejiang province from Wenzhou. And they were appointed to open up an overseas mediation station, the court. So that's what we're seeing. The other affected states beyond New York and California were Hawaii and sort of the greater Washington area. So specifically Gaithersburg, Maryland of all places, was also home to one of these civic associations from which their officials were meeting with Ministry of Public Security officials.
What are the people who defend this kind of practice, saying, well, why is this necessary? Why should U.S. nonprofits be involved in it whatsoever?
The Chinese government believes that it has a right and a responsibility to protect the legitimate rights of overseas Chinese. That's the language that they use. And when we are looking at this, they believe that they should be providing services for additional convenience to their overseas compatriots. And so they are saying that these courts, they're there to ostensibly provide services for some type of, Chinese driver's license renewal. This is what we actually saw the America Changla Association's police station purporting to be offering. And they're also, we found cases in California where they were involved allegedly in helping conduct some type of international divorce settlement or things of that nature.
Philip, when we think about a justice system, we think about it meeting justice as well, not necessarily those sort of social service descriptions that you just provided. Did any of your reporting uncover consequences or enforcement actions as part of this shadow system?
We didn't find that currently any of these locations had been involved in any type of criminal proceedings. But as with any type of case, there's going to be decisions rendered by the courts which are going to impact individuals. And so this sort of brings up the main concern, which is that folks who might find themselves brought in before one of these courts could be leveraged to work for Chinese government interests based on the fact that they wish for a verdict to be returned in their favor. So these are some of the concerns, and especially given that America Changla Association was operating this overseas police station, but just making the same type of claims that it was only providing mundane legal services like Chinese driver's license renewal. That really raises the specter that these overseas courts could also be involved in much more.
Phil, thank you so much for joining us to talk about this. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much for your time. Thank you.
That does it for us today on Rising. Please be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we're now available anywhere you can get your podcast fix. See you tomorrow.